On a Tuesday morning in March of 1984, Earl Hatch walked out of the First Farmers Bank of Granger, Kansas, with a single sheet of paper gripped in his hand. Behind him stood 3 generations of land and the sweat of men who didn't know how to quit. But the paper in front of him told a different story. The letter stated his collateral was insufficient, which was just a polite way for a man in a suit to tell him he was finished. There was a machine sitting in the back shed on his property that the bank hadn't bothered to look at twice during their appraisal. It was a 1963 John Deere 4010 that sat cracked, seized, and silent for years, and the bank inspectors had written it off as nothing more than worthless scrap. The bank was wrong. Let me tell you about Earl, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. And the truth is that the man doesn't make sense without the land under his boots. His grandfather, Clement Hatch, broke the sod in southwest Kansas back in 1911 using a team of mules and a one-bottom plow. He didn't borrow a dime to get started because he didn't have any access to credit, so he simply worked ground that had never seen a blade. He built a life from nothing, acre by acre and season by season, until he finally had 140 acres of dirt he could pass down to his son. Earl's father, Roy, took those same 140 acres through the heart of the Dust Bowl, and that is something worth sitting with for a moment. The 1930s in southwest Kansas weren't just hard times, they were extinction-level events for anyone trying to make a living from the soil. Roy watched his neighbors walk away from their lives, but he stayed and hung wet sheets over the windows to keep the grit out of the house. He planted whatever he could, and he held on tight. And by the time Earl was born in 1930, Roy had managed to keep every single acre in the family name. Earl eventually inherited 140 acres of paid-off ground and a sense of obligation that ran bone deep, because he knew this land had survived too much history to be lost on his watch. When the 1970s arrived, and every ag lender in Kansas was practically begging farmers to expand their operations, Earl decided to listen. You can't really blame the man for that, because the numbers looked solid on the ledger. Land in his county was running about $800 an acre and climbing every year, while loan rates sat at 9%. And wheat was fetching $4.50 a bushel. The export market was pulling hard because the Soviets needed American grain, and every extension agent and banker in a 3-county radius was saying that now was the time to grow. In 1978, Earl bought 200 additional acres that adjoined his south field for $800 an acre, and he financed a new John Deere 4450 to handle the bigger workload. He took on an operating line of credit for his seed, fuel, and chemicals to keep the wheels turning. At 9% interest on land worth $800 an acre, producing wheat at $4.50 a bushel, the math worked out, though it was a tight fit some years. Now, let me tell you about the 4010, because it's the real hero of this story, and you need to know why it was there. When Earl brought home the 4450, his father's old tractor was moved to the back of the shed to gather dust. That 1963 John Deere 4010 had been the workhorse of the farm for 15 years, featuring 80 horsepower on the PTO and a 6-cylinder diesel engine. Roy had bought it brand new, and Earl had worn the seat smooth over a decade of long days. But the new machine made the old iron redundant. Earl didn't sell the tractor, even though he'd run the numbers on what it might bring at auction, and decided the cash wasn't worth the loss. He kept the fluids topped and the battery on a trickle charge for a year or two, but eventually he stopped doing even that. The tractor went quiet in the dark corner of the shed, while the new, air-conditioned machine took over the heavy lifting in the fields. That is the thing about old iron, because you don't always know why you keep it around until you actually need it. Sometimes you just can't let go of a machine that has never let you down. And while that felt like sentiment in 1978, it became a lifeline by 1984. The story doesn't end there, but first, the floor fell out from under the American farmer. And it didn't happen slowly. It didn't arrive with a warning. That's the part people forget about the farm crisis. There was no single moment where you could have seen it coming and stepped aside. It came from 3 directions at once, and by the time any one of them would have been survivable on its own, all 3 had already landed. The first hit came in the fall of 1979. The Federal Reserve was trying to choke off inflation that had been running hot for years, so they tightened the money supply hard. The prime rate climbed to 15%, then 18%, and it finally touched 21% before the dust settled. Earl's operating line was a variable rate because that's what the bank offered and that's what almost every farmer in Kansas had signed. When the rate repriced, his annual debt payment didn't just nudge upward, it nearly doubled. The land he'd bought at $800 an acre was still producing the same wheat, but the money he owed on it had suddenly gotten a lot more expensive. The second hit came in 1980. President Carter was responding to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, so he cut grain exports to the USSR. The Soviets had been buying American wheat by the shipload, and when that market closed, prices dropped fast. Wheat that had been fetching $4.50 a bushel fell below $3.50 and just kept sliding. The math Earl had run in 1978, the math that worked at 9% rates and $4.50 wheat, simply stopped working. He was now paying more to service the debt while receiving less for the crop that was supposed to cover it. He tightened down. He deferred maintenance and cut inputs where he could. He told himself the rates would come back and the embargo wouldn't last forever, and he just needed to hold on long enough for things to level out. And they did level out. Some. But level wasn't enough. Level just meant the bleeding slowed. Then came 1983. Southwest Kansas dried out that summer in a way that old-timers said they hadn't seen since the Dust Bowl years. Earl put 2 consecutive short crops in the bin, which were harvests that covered operating costs and not much else. The cash reserves he'd built through the decent years of the late 1970s were gone. He was borrowing against the next harvest to pay the bills from this one, and that is the kind of math that only moves in one direction. The bank changed, too. The loan officer who'd shaken Earl's hand in 1978 and told him the 200-acre expansion was a sound move had retired. The man who sat across the desk from Earl now wore a better suit and carried a legal pad covered in debt-to-asset ratios. There was a district supervisor who visited twice a year and reviewed every file. The handshake world that Earl's father had operated in, the world where a man's 30-year record meant something, had been replaced by a spreadsheet world, and Earl's spreadsheet didn't look good. He walked into First Farmers Bank of Granger in March of 1984 and laid out what he needed. $40,000 in operating credit for seed, fuel, and chemicals. This was the minimum required to put a crop in the ground and have any chance at all of climbing out of the hole he was in. He wasn't asking for a rescue. He was asking for one more season. The answer came back in less than a week. The letter used 3 sentences to say it. Collateral insufficient. Debt-to-asset ratio outside acceptable lending parameters. No projected cash flow sufficient to service additional debt obligations. Earl read it twice at the kitchen table, then set it on top of his father's farm ledger. That ledger went back to 1947. Roy Hatch had recorded every bushel, every input cost, and every payment made and received in columns so clean and consistent You could read the man's character in the handwriting alone. 37 years of a family's financial life sat under a letter that had been generated in under a week by a man who had never walked Earl's ground. He didn't call the bank. He didn't drive back in to argue. He'd seen enough of that from neighbors, the meetings that went nowhere and the appeals that produced more paperwork and the same answer. Earl wasn't built for that kind of fight. He was built for a different kind. The next morning, he walked his equipment line before the sun was fully up, going down the row the way you'd inventory a hardware store after a robbery. He was methodical, and he didn't flinch at what was missing. The 4450 was collateral on the land note. The planter was on a separate lien. The grain cart, the pickup, and the anhydrous applicator were all either financed or pledged against something. He owned almost nothing outright. Almost. He walked to the back of the shed. The 4010 sat where it had been sitting since 1978, with 6 years of dust on the hood and a swallow's nest in the exhaust stack. Both rear tires were soft but not flat. Earl stood in front of it for a long moment. Then he pulled the nest out of the stack, found an old rag on the workbench, and wiped the cereal plate clean. He started a list. The exhaust manifold had 2 visible cracks at the flange, which were hairline fractures from years of heat cycling with no coolant changes, and then sitting cold and damp through Kansas winters. A dealer would call that a parts job. Quote you $2,200 and order a 6-week wait. Earl saw 2 weld repairs and a resurface. The injection pump had seized from sitting. Diesel fuel degrades and varnishes form, and a pump that doesn't move for 6 years tends to stay stopped. A commercial rebuild ran $1,500 or more. Earl saw a teardown and a cleaning, and maybe a new O-ring kit if he was lucky. The crankshaft was the real problem. He rocked the front pulley by hand and felt the play before he even got out a dial indicator. There was too much end float, which meant the thrust bearings had worn past spec, and the crank was walking in the block with every power stroke. Left alone, it would knock itself to pieces. A dealer pulling that engine would quote you a number that started at 5,000 and went up from there. Earl wrote it on his list and didn't put the pencil down. Here's what he understood about this tractor that the bank's appraisal didn't capture. The 4010 was not complicated. It was a 380 cubic inch 6-cylinder diesel built when mechanics still designed engines for other mechanics to fix. Every surface was machinable. Every clearance was measurable. Every part that had failed for a reason he could identify, and every one of those reasons had a solution that didn't require a dealership. The bank had looked at this machine and seen scrap value. Earl looked at it and saw a harvest. He wasn't certain he could do it, but he understood the machine well enough to know the machine could be fixed, and right now, that was enough to start on. He capped his pen, folded the list, and put it in his chest pocket next to the denial letter. Let me tell you about the repair, because that's where the real story lives. The manifold came off first because it was the fastest win, and Earl knew he needed a win to keep his momentum. On a Tuesday morning, he pulled the part and found both flanges cracked clean through at the casting seam. These were the kind of fractures that spread slow over years of heat and cold until one day the exhaust just leaks straight into your face. He wrapped the heavy iron in a moving blanket, set it in the truck bed, and drove 2 hours to a machine shop in Dodge City. The shop was run by a man named Pruitt, who had been welding cast iron since before Earl was old enough to drive a tractor. Pruitt looked at the damage for about 30 seconds, quoted him $340, and told him to come back on Thursday. Earl returned that Thursday to find the job finished right. Pruitt had welded both cracks with nickel rod, letting the metal cool slowly to prevent new fractures. And then he resurfaced the flange face on his mill until it sat dead flat. Earl ran his thumbnail across the metal and found it as smooth as a new gasket. He paid Pruitt in cash and started the long drive home. A dealership would have charged $2,200 for a replacement manifold and made him wait 6 weeks for it to ship from Waterloo. But Pruitt charged a fraction of that and turned it around in 4 days because he actually understood the work. That is the difference between a man who fixes things and a man who just reads a parts catalog. The injection pump took 2 long evenings of concentration. Earl pulled it apart at the kitchen table, a workspace his wife Margaret had quietly accepted over 40 years of marriage without ever quite making peace with the smell of diesel. The pump had seized from varnish, which happens when old fuel breaks down into lacquer after sitting for 6 years. It gums up every internal surface until nothing can move. Earl soaked the components in mineral spirits and worked each part clean with a soft brush. Then he dried everything and reassembled the unit with a new O-ring kit he had ordered from a catalog out of Iowa. The kit cost $47 and took 2 evenings of his time. But once the pump was back on the engine, he had to face the hard problem. The crankshaft was the real hurdle. He had known since the first morning that this was the repair that could stop the whole project. Thrust-bearing wear is one of those things that looks like an engine death sentence to anyone who doesn't understand what is actually happening inside the block. The crank itself was not damaged, but it was moving more than it should, rocking forward and back in the bore with every power stroke because the thrust surface had worn thin. If he left it alone, the vibration would eventually knock the engine apart. But the solution was not a new engine. The solution was a lathe. Earl made a phone call to a man named Herschel Briggs, a retired John Deere mechanic who lived 2 counties east and still kept a South Bend lathe in his barn. Some men do not stop being mechanics just because they stop getting paid for it, and Herschel had known Roy Hatch, which mattered more to Earl than any corporate credential. Earl explained the situation over the phone, and Herschel told him to come by on Saturday and bring the engine with him. They pulled the 4010's engine together, the 2 of them working without any hurry and talking through each step the way men do when they both already know the trade. Herschel measured the crank journals on his lathe before turning and polishing them back to a true surface. While he worked, Earl installed new main bearings and shimmed the thrust to bring the end play back within the original specs. The parts cost came in under $600, and Earl paid Herschel in beef with a side from a steer he had been meaning to butcher anyway. Herschel seemed to prefer that arrangement over a check. They set the engine back in the frame on a Sunday afternoon in early April. Earl climbed up into the seat, set the throttle, and hit the starter. The 4010 cranked twice. Then it cranked a 3rd time, and on that 3rd rotation, the 6-cylinder caught and stumbled for half a second. It settled into a deep, even idle that filled the shed and rattled the tin roof above them. There was no knock and no miss, just the sound of a big diesel engine deciding it was not done working yet. Earl sat there with his hand on the throttle and watched the gauges while the oil pressure climbed and the temperature started its slow rise toward the operating range. He listened for sounds that should not be there, but he heard only the rhythmic mechanical music of a healthy machine. He let the tractor run for 20 minutes without saying a single word. The machine worked, and now he had to find a way to make it work hard enough to matter. Planting season was only 3 weeks away, and while Earl had a tractor, he still needed everything else to get a crop in the ground. Seed, fuel, and chemicals added up to $40,000 worth of inputs that the bank had just told him he could not borrow. He sat at the kitchen table the night after that first start and wrote down what he needed, what it would cost, and where it might come from. The numbers simply did not work unless someone along the line was willing to trust him, the way the bank refused to do. He drove to the co-op in Granger the next morning to see Dale Murchison, the manager who had been selling seed to Earl for over 22 years. Earl laid out his situation without dressing it up or making excuses. He told Dale the bank had said no, but he had a crop to plant and needed seed on 90-day terms to be paid in full at harvest. Dale did not ask for any paperwork or pull a credit report, because he had watched Earl Hatch farm for 2 decades and knew what a man's word was worth. They shook hands across the desk to seal the agreement, and there is no column on a bank spreadsheet for that kind of transaction. No risk model can quantify 22 years of a man showing up and doing what he said he would do. Fuel came from a neighbor named Wayne Pettit, who ran the local elevator and kept a large tank on his property. It was the same arrangement and a different handshake, with Earl promising to settle the bill at harvest time. Wayne said that was fine and topped off the tank without writing a single word down on paper. The 4010 went to work during the first week of April. It was slower than the 4450, but Earl had always known that and planned his days around the difference in speed. The 4450 could cover ground at a pace that made you feel like you were winning a race. But the 4010 worked like a mule. It was steady and pulled its share every hour of every day without complaint, though you were never going to confuse it for a fast machine. Earl adjusted his schedule by starting earlier and running later, and he stopped expecting the old iron to be something it was not. Every morning the engine started, and every evening it was still running when he finally shut it down. That was the bargain he had made with the machine. What the 4010 could not give him was the protection of a cab. Southwest Kansas in late April is not forgiving country, especially when the heat builds early and the wind moves the topsoil if you have tilled the ground too fine. There is nothing between a man and the elements when the tractor is a 1963 model with an open station and a hard metal seat. Earl was 54 years old, and he felt every hour of the work by the end of the day. The vibration came up through the seat and into his lower back while the grit collected in his collar, and the sun beat down on his neck through a full 12-hour shift. He did not mention the pain to anyone, because there was no one he wanted to worry. The close call happened in late May. A hydraulic line on the planter let go around 3 in the afternoon when a fitting failed and sprayed fluid across the furrow opener. The nearest dealer was more than 2 hours away and would be closing at 5, so Earl climbed down and pulled the toolbox from behind the seat. He found the old coffee can he had kept back there since 1971, which was packed with fittings, short lengths of hose, and the kind of small hardware that accumulates in a working shop over the years. He spliced the line in 40 minutes using what he had on hand, then he bled the system and finished the field before the sun went down. A modern tractor might have thrown a fault code and locked him out of the system, but the 4010 let him fix the problem with a can of parts and his own 2 hands. By the 1st of June, the crop was in the ground and every acre was accounted for. It had not been fast or comfortable, and Earl's back reminded him of the cost every morning when he stood up from the bed. But the seed was planted and the soil was right, and the ground did not care what the bank thought about his finances. Meanwhile, Earl did not know it yet, but First Farmers Bank of Granger was having a very difficult spring of its own. August arrived with a heavy, breathless heat that only a Kansas summer can produce, and the wheat stood tall and ready for the blade. On a Monday morning before the cutting began, Earl walked out into his south field to check the progress. He pulled random heads of grain and stripped them clean with his thumb, just like his father had shown him decades ago. He bit down on a kernel to feel the resistance, judging the moisture by the way the grain gave way under his teeth. The crop was ready, and to be honest, It looked better than he had any right to expect. Those spring rains had hit at exactly the right intervals to fill the heads out before the dry summer heat could wreck the yield. He had seen much worse years while carrying far better credit. To get the crop in, Earl had worked out a deal to rent a combine from his neighbor, Carl Adkins. Carl was finishing his own ground first and would have a small window of time in late August to let the machine go. That meant Earl would use the 4010 for every other job on the place, from pulling the grain cart to dragging equipment between the fields. It was the kind of work that creates 100 small, grueling tasks that never actually show up on a bank's balance sheet. The old Deere was about to earn its keep in a way the appraisers in their air-conditioned offices could never have imagined. During that first day of cutting, Earl stayed in the seat of the 4010 from 6 in the morning until the last bit of light quit on him at 9 that night. That 15-hour shift didn't seem to bother the machine one bit. The 6-cylinder engine put its head down and lugged the heavy grain cart across the soft dirt at the field edges without spinning a tire. It held its ground on the steep incline coming out of the draw, and when the sun came up the next day, it started cold without a single complaint. Herschel's precision crankwork held firm, and the manifold Pruitt had welded stayed sealed. Even the injection pump Earl had painstakingly rebuilt on his own kitchen table held its pressure. Everything he had touched and repaired stayed together under a real load, which is the only test that actually matters in this business. By the fourth evening of the harvest, the sun was dropping behind the tree line and the sky had turned that dusty gold color you only see in the Midwest. Earl was dragging a topped-off cart across the stubble when the 4010 hit a hard pull on a rising grade, causing the governor to snap wide open. The sound of the exhaust changed instantly, shifting from a steady, rhythmic beat to a raw, high-pitched howl that signaled the engine was working at the very edge of its capability. You could hear that Deere scream from a quarter-mile away as a thin line of gray smoke rose from the stack. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the scent of fresh-cut wheat in the cooling air, and Earl felt the change in vibration through the palms of his hands. He eased the throttle back just a hair until the engine settled into a groove, and he finished the pull. He didn't spend a single minute thinking about the bank or their letters. He was too busy being a farmer. The night after the very last load went to the elevator, Earl sat down at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad to see where he stood. He had harvested 12,920 bushels from his 340 acres, which averaged out to about 38 bushels per acre. At a price of $3.40 a bushel, not the $4.50 he'd seen in the boom years, but enough, he was looking at a gross of $43,928. He started doing the math, subtracting what he owed Dale at the co-op for the seed and taking out the fuel bill from Wayne Pettit. He subtracted the combine rental, the repair parts, Pruitt's welding fee, and the money he'd sent home with Herschel for the machine work. He added the numbers up twice because he needed to be absolutely sure he was right. When the dust settled, the money that was left covered his entire operating debt and made a significant dent in the land note. It left him with enough breathing room going into the fall that he didn't have to borrow a dime against next year's hopes. He had made it through the woods. 2 weeks later, Earl drove into town to the First Farmers Bank of Granger with a cashier's check to make his payment. The same loan officer who had mailed him that cold denial letter back in March was sitting at a desk behind a glass partition. When the man looked up and saw Earl standing at the teller window, a strange look crossed his face that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't quite comfort either. It was an awkward expression that the man clearly hoped Earl wouldn't notice, but Earl didn't say a word about it. He just took his receipt, folded it carefully, and walked back out to his truck. What Earl didn't realize as he drove home that afternoon was that federal bank examiners had already been digging through the files at First Farmers twice that summer. The bank's agricultural portfolio was bleeding, and they were carrying so many bad loans that the regulators in Kansas City were starting to circle. The very institution that had told Earl he wasn't a good risk was about to find out what it felt like to need help and have no one offer it. The liquidation notices started hitting the mailboxes 3 weeks later. Earl found out about the upcoming land auction the same way every other farmer in the county did. He saw a notice taped to the bulletin board at the co-op, printed on a plain sheet of white paper with the land listed by its legal description. It was a cold, impersonal way to describe a piece of the earth. 160 acres in Section 14, right up against Earl's own south field. That ground belonged to Darrell Foss, and Earl had watched Darrell lose it the previous October. He remembered watching Darrell load a single truck in the yard of a farmhouse his family had owned since 1952, before driving away without ever looking back. The bank had seized the land in foreclosure and sat on it through the winter. But now the bank was in trouble, and they needed cash a lot more than they needed dirt. On a Thursday morning in April of 1985, Earl drove to the auction with a cashier's check tucked into the inside pocket of his good coat. That money represented everything the harvest had left over after every single debt had been paid in full. It was money that only existed because he had chosen to spend $340 with Pruitt and $47 on an O-ring kit instead of signing his life away on a new machine he couldn't afford. The crowd at the auction was thin and quiet. There were maybe a dozen men standing around in a gravel lot, and most of them were just there to watch the end of an era rather than actually bid. It felt more like a funeral than a business transaction, and nobody there seemed to be enjoying themselves. Land that had once sold for $900 an acre when times were good was being offered for less than half that, and the auctioneer's voice rang out across the lot without much interference. When the time came, Earl put in his bid, and nobody in the crowd pushed back against him very hard. He walked away with those 160 acres for $62,000, which came out to just under $390 an acre for ground that had been farmed since the 50s. It was a steal, and the land would be worth 10 times that within a generation. But Earl just wrote the number down as a fact. He didn't feel like celebrating, because he knew he was buying his neighbor's legacy at a discount, because his neighbor had failed, and there is no joy in that. The loan officer from First Farmers was there too, standing at the back of the lot in a fine coat to oversee the sale of the bank's foreclosed assets. He was the same man who had written Earl's denial letter exactly 1 year earlier. When Earl walked up to sign the deed transfer, the two men made eye contact, but neither of them said a single word. Earl just folded the deed, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked away. That fall, Earl took the 4010 out and began working the new ground. The very tractor the bank had dismissed as worthless scrap was now turning the soil on land the bank had been forced to sell. That isn't some poetic metaphor for how life works. It is exactly what happened on that farm. Earl didn't come out on top because he was faster or more clever than the men sitting behind the desks in town. He won because he had a deep understanding of what he actually owned, from the dirt under his boots to the machine in his shed and the neighbors he could count on. The bank understood the numbers on a spreadsheet, but they didn't understand the value of a man who knows how to shim a crankshaft. That 4010 is likely still out there working somewhere because old iron like that just doesn't know how to quit. The same goes for the men who understand how to keep those machines running. If you know someone who's been told their vintage tractor isn't worth the effort, you should send them this video. Subscribe to see more stories about the equipment and the people who outlasted everyone who counted them out, because there are plenty more where Earl came from.